Welcome to the Mind and Matter podcast. I'm your host, Nick Jikomes, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Jonathan Schaefer. Jonathan has a PhD in clinical psychology, and he is currently a research psychologist at the University of Minnesota Institute of Child Development. His research focuses largely on the relationship between people's environments and the influence that has on their mental health. He has conducted a number of longitudinal studies using cohorts of identical and fraternal twins, which allows him to tease apart the relative role of genetics and different environmental factors in different psychiatric outcomes. My conversation with Jonathan focused mainly on recent twin studies that he has done, looking into the relationship between adolescent cannabis or marijuana use and psychosis. The main question posed by this work is whether or not there is likely a causal link between chronic cannabis use in adolescence and symptoms of psychosis later in life, which has been an area of unresolved controversy in the research world for some time. We talked about what psychosis is and what factors are linked to it. We discussed historical work on the relationship between cannabis use and psychosis, and Jonathan described the results of his recent twin studies and what they actually mean. As always, if you enjoy the content that you find on this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. There are a few different ways you can support the podcast. One is to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. The other is to subscribe and to like the videos on the YouTube version. And the other way is to sign up for either my free weekly Mind and Matter newsletter on Substack or to become a paid subscriber, which is $5 per month and gets you early access to shows and other subscriber-only content. Today's show is brought to you in part by Dosist, an all-natural cannabis company specializing in dose-controlled cannabis products made with plant-based ingredients. To learn more about Dosist, their products, and where they are available, please visit their website through the link in the episode description. This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food-sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy-free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it with the first meal of each day, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure, and vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system and for a variety of other things. And there's even evidence indicating that vitamin D deficiency is correlated with more severe cases of COVID-19 in those who get infected. Every time I go into the doctor each year for a checkup, I'm always told that vitamin D deficiency is very common and I should be supplementing on a daily basis. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase. And with that, here's my conversation with Jonathan Schaefer. Jonathan Schaefer, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Nick. I'm excited to be here.
Can you give everyone a quick intro in terms of who you are and what you actually do professionally?
Yeah, sure. So my name is John Schaefer. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the moment at the University of Minnesota Institute for Child Development. And what I do is I conduct research on the relationship between environmental exposures, which is just a term that I use to encompass both kind of lived experiences that people have and things in their environment that they come into contact with, the relationship between those types of things and their later mental health.
Interesting. And so what's your training and background in? Are you a psychologist?
Yeah, so I have my PhD in clinical psychology from Duke University. I have a recently minted PhD. I got that in 2019. And then I have been at the University of Minnesota for postdoc pretty much since that time.
Interesting. So what's just at a very, very high level, what have you been studying? What have you been interested in studying? And how did you sort of get into this as an interest area?
Yeah, good question. So my research now, I said I'm interested in environmental exposures. So that's a broad category. So kind of during my graduate and postdoctoral research careers, I've studied a number of different kinds of exposures. So in graduate school, I did research on the relationship between victimization and mental health. So things like maltreatment, victimization by peers, sexual abuse, victimization by like crime victimization, among other things. And then also published a few papers with colleagues in grad school looking at the effects of exposure to lead levels in early childhood and air pollution as well. So those you can look up and find under my name easily enough. But as a postdoc, what my research is focused on instead is specifically the effects of cannabis exposure. So this is a topic that I got interested in after starting my postdoc. I chose my postdoc for reasons that we might get into later, but essentially I chose it kind of for, shall we say, like methodological synergy between what I was doing as a postdoc and what I was doing as a graduate student. And it just so happens that the data that I have available to me as a postdoctoral fellow are particularly centered around substance use and cannabis use in particular. So it's been a great position and has given me access to a lot of really great resources in terms of the data to answer these types of questions. And of course, the fact that the U.S. is seeing this moment, this sort of sweeping sea change in cannabis legalization, means that these types of questions have captured a lot of people's interests, including lawmakers and policymakers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, some of the recent work you've done was piquing my interest because I work in the cannabis industry, so this is sort of something I've thought about a lot. And this is something that a lot of people have had top of mind for quite a while, actually. What is the relationship between brain development and substance use? In particular, we're going to talk about cannabis today, but as a general topic, there's obvious importance to this area, right? Whether or not something can impact brain development is critical to understand. And as you mentioned, this sort of wave of legalization that's been happening the last number of years really sort of brings this to the forefront because for obvious reasons, more people are now having the opportunity to be exposed to and to choose to use something like cannabis. And so it makes perfect sense that we should be very careful to understand exactly what the effects on the brain and on health are of cannabis, especially if you're starting at an early age.
That's right.
So the main thing I think we're going to talk about today has to do with your most recent research, which is more or less centered on this question of, does using cannabis in adolescence increase the odds of developing psychosis? And I would love if you could start off by just defining some of the territory here for us. So let's start with psychosis. What exactly is psychosis as defined by a psychologist?
Sure. So just before I provide that definition, I also want to mention that my work's looked at actually a bunch of different mental health outcomes. Psychosis is kind of one of many. My most recent paper focused on psychosis. And the reason for that is because there's observational epidemiological research out there that suggests the relationship between cannabis and psychosis might be particularly strong. So what is psychosis? Psychosis is a condition of the mind. It's a kind of a constellation of symptoms, but the main, textbook definition would be a state of mind where the patient or the individual is having trouble telling what is real and what is not real. So this is where you see symptoms like delusions and hallucinations, delusions being kind of persistent false beliefs on the one hand, and hallucinations would be experiencing kind of sensory input that is not there. Those are kind of two of the core symptoms of psychosis. And then you can also see additional things in some individuals like incoherent speech, inappropriate behavior, and oftentimes that can really mess up a person's life, even if the experience of psychosis itself is a relatively transitory one.
And could you give us some specific examples that people might have heard of that are clear examples of a psychotic state?
Sure. So I spent 2 years after undergrad. I worked in a lab that was studying schizophrenia specifically. And it was a really fascinating job because one of the things that I was responsible for was administering cognitive tests to both individuals with a schizophrenia diagnosis and then healthy family members and siblings of these folks, as well as healthy controls. And so in doing that job, I kind of got to encounter a lot of different people, a lot of patients, and a lot of different manifestations of kind of what we think of as psychosis. So a few that have stuck with me over the years is I remember one individual kind of was operating under the persistent belief that he was in a romantic relationship with Emma Watson, the Harry Potter actress. And, that in and of itself might be possible or perhaps provable. But, there were also other beliefs attached to that, which was that she would send him kind of secret messages, reinforcing her affection for him, that she would break into his room on the inpatient ward at night and leave him sort of special messages that only he could see. She would move maybe, his clock on his bedside table ever so slightly, so he would know that she had been there. I met another individual who, another example of a delusion, believed that he was an angel from a kind of different dimension and was, being sent here for some sort of special purpose. Third individual that I'll always remember had the sort of fixed belief that everyone around him could read his thoughts, which made interacting with him very challenging, especially giving cognitive tests to someone who's kind of operating with that belief in mind. And hallucinations also can take kind of as varied a form as delusions. I would say auditory hallucinations, I believe, are the most common. So that would be, hearing things that aren't there, such as someone calling your name or hearing voices. Sometimes which can tell you nice or neutral things, but especially when they become problematic, are often saying, mean or threatening things. But that you can see a kind of a whole gradient there. And then on this more extreme end, you can even, have folks reporting visual hallucinations, which is seeing individuals who aren't there. Other kind of perceptual abnormalities, the walls moving in ways that they shouldn't. Insects on areas or objects or people that no one else can see. So it's a pretty wide spectrum, just kind of united by this sort of core definition.
I see. So is it fair to say that maybe a general way to think about this is that psychosis or psychotic state is when something's going on in the brain such that the person's thoughts and behaviors and perceptions just are not matching up with their sensory environment?
Yeah, I think that would be fair. Delusions, you could argue, is maybe less close to sensory input than hallucinations. I think it'd be fair to say there are probably multiple kind of separable brain mechanisms going on that contribute to what we generally call psychosis. But kind of like you're saying, the core feature is this disconnect between the reality that the person is perceiving and the reality that kind of everyone else is perceiving.
I see. And then, the other thing I think I want to make clear here is, so you've already told us that psychosis is this sort of constellation of things. It can manifest in different ways in different people. Mm-hmm. Is it also fair to say that we should also think about this as a kind of spectrum, meaning that, on one side of the spectrum could be full-blown psychosis in a severe case of schizophrenia, say, but on the other side could just be, little sort of micro-psychotic symptoms that even normal people experience all the time. I think we've all had the experience of, I swore I just heard my name, but no one said it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that experience is ubiquitous enough that if that happens to you, once, twice, a couple dozen times over the course of a year, probably nothing to be concerned about. So there's a branch of psychological research that's called taxonometrics, where people look at kind of psychiatric disorders or symptoms, and they try to answer the question using these sophisticated statistical methods of whether these constructs are actually separable categories of experience that have distinct kind of fixed boundaries to them, or just kind of broad continua where people kind of slide from one end of the scale to the next. Both between individuals, meaning like different people will fall at different points along the scale, and then even within an individual, they might be at a different point on this spectrum, the psychotic spectrum or any other spectrum, over the course of their lives. And by and large, what taxonometric research tells us is that the vast majority of mental health problems do fall or are more kind of appropriately conceptualized as being continuous in nature. And so psychosis is no exception.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I think is worth clarifying up front, so multiple times I've had the experience where I'm talking to a non-scientist or non-psychologist usually, but they'll be interested in this general topic. And they'll say, say that they've tried to read a scientific paper, and it could be about cannabis or psychedelics or something like that. And they'll read something like, cannabis is a psychotomimetic drug. And they'll say to themselves, wait a minute, like I know a lot of people that smoke cannabis and that doesn't turn you schizophrenic. Like you don't go into psychosis while you're high. So what exactly does a term like that mean when we say that a substance can be psychotomimetic?
So psychotomimetic really just means can cause, another term you might hear is like psychotic-like symptoms. So a relatively common, although not ubiquitous, side effect of cannabis consumption, at least for some people or at some dosage, can be paranoia. Mm-hmm. So people will report, if they're consuming a lot of cannabis, particularly if they're doing it maybe through edibles or more intense methods of administration, that they sort of hit maybe a relaxed, kind of slightly euphoric feeling at the outset, but as the dose builds and builds and builds, they find their affect getting a lot more anxious, and then accompanying that might be lots of anxious thoughts, like everyone's looking at me, or like, oh, I feel weird, I wonder if people notice. And kind of, if you push that to an extreme degree, that starts to resemble some of the paranoid thinking or processes that you might see in someone with a diagnosable psychotic illness.
I see. So it kind of does make sense. Like even if you just think about normal paranoia, if you smoke some weed or ingest some other drug and you get paranoid, not that you're having like a full-on true psychotic break, but right. You just think, hey, everyone's looking at me, but they're actually not. That's a psychosis-like symptom.
Right. And of course, the difference, right, between a sort of transitory psychotic state and a psychotic disorder is that in one case, the effects or the kind of causes of the transitory psychotic state are very clearly the substance that the person just ingested. And those symptoms only happen when the person is using that substance. Whereas in the case of a psychotic disorder, it is more repeated, more all-encompassing and impairing, and it can be exacerbated when a person is using substances, but then also the symptoms have to be present during periods where they're not using as well.
I see. So it is true that certain substances, the acute consumption of them, when you're in the intoxicated state, can produce mild or transient psychotic-like experiences.
That's right.
I've also read that substances can also, including cannabis, can also make the ongoing chronic symptoms of someone with a psychotic disorder worse. Is that true? And to what extent do we know that?
Yes. So that's on my specific area of research, because I'm focusing on these kind of large population-based studies rather than studies of, say, in patients with a psychotic disorder. But my understanding of that research is that is true. So if you do have a psychotic illness, generally it is a good idea to stay away from these psychomimetic substances because it can exacerbate symptoms, bring on psychotic breaks, and might even affect you kind of more intensely than others, given that your brain sort of in its natural state already has a kind of predisposition towards going down these sorts of neural pathways.
Got it. So we've sort of established what psychosis is. We've talked a little bit about schizophrenia. The other thing I want to do up front is talk about cannabis use disorder. So what exactly is that, and how do we define it, and how common is it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the kind of technical definition of cannabis use disorder has changed slightly over the years. So in the earlier versions of DSM, we saw it bifurcated in cannabis abuse versus cannabis dependence. And when you're talking about abuse versus dependence, the sort of general distinction is your use of the substance causing problems for you in kind of daily living? Is use of your substance causing legal problems? Is it causing role impairment? Is it, causing difficulties for you? Whereas dependence typically refers to the more kind of physiological set of symptoms. So we think about things like tolerance, needing more and more of the substance to kind of get the same effect, or withdrawal symptoms. So when you kind of take the substance away, someone starts to experiencing kind of ill effects from just the lack of the substance being there. So cannabis is an interesting one because the withdrawal effects are, in general, not nearly as pronounced as they are for other substances, like alcohol in particular. So if you're extremely alcohol dependent and alcohol is withdrawn too abruptly, that can actually cause someone to, need to be hospitalized and die at the very extremes. Whereas cannabis, that is not really possible with just the way that cannabis's chemistry works. But sort of those two conditions have been subsumed now under the general heading of a cannabis use disorder. So DSM-5, the most recent version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, no longer really distinguishes between abuse and dependence. They've just taken symptoms from both categories and kind of put them under a sort of general subheading. And I think the reason for that is because usually when you have abuse symptoms, you very often will have the dependence symptoms as well. They often go kind of hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. So this general topic of the relationship between cannabis use and psychosis has a fairly lengthy history. People have cared about this for a while. I think there's been, a pretty good amount of research on it. What's sort of made it difficult in my perception is that on the one hand, it's just sort of very difficult to get a truly definitive study out there. So like no study's perfect. A lot of it's based on correlation and you can't really establish causality, and we're going to get into that. Yeah. But then the other thing too is, there's sort of people with a leg in the race, right? There's some people that really want to believe one way, and some people that really want to believe the opposite way on this topic. And I think that has also contributed to how, is it fair to say this is an area that's been controversial in the literature?
Yes, I would agree with that. And because, like you're saying, there are definitely individuals out there with kind of a vested interest in how the research on this potential link shakes out, right? If you're a manufacturer of cannabis products, it's really good news if the kind of link between cannabis and severe mental health problems like psychosis turns out to be spurious. Whereas if you're on the other side of the equation, you have objections to cannabis for, personal reasons, religious reasons, perhaps some kind of financial stake on the opposing side. Yeah, you'd like to see very much the opposite.
Could you give us maybe a synopsis or some kind of general overview of how is the research on this potential link between psychosis and cannabis? How has it progressed over the last 10 or 20 years, and what have the main schools of thought been? What have the major results been, and what have been their sort of gaps and limitations so far?
Sure. So research on cannabis and psychosis, by and large, has occurred. I guess first we can bifurcate it into observational research and experimental research. So in experimental research, you can do kind of the gold standard type of study for supporting what we call causal inference, which is kind of making sure that manipulation or exposure X, in this case, cannabis itself, is actually driving your outcome Y. So in a randomized controlled study, you can do that. You have a really strong ability to approach causal inference because you can take people, you can randomly assign them to have a little cannabis or THC versus not, and you can kind of examine the effects. And so the experimental literature on cannabis has been really useful as far as understanding the acute consequences of cannabis use. So this is where we get the knowledge that, cannabis is associated with these short-term psychotic symptoms in a number of individuals. It's how we know that cannabis influences hunger, sleep, pain sensitivity, and all these different types of physiological functions. A limitation of the experimental literature is you can't give cannabis to human beings for prolonged periods of time. Because of possible ethical issues or the possibility that you're actually doing people some harm, right? Mm-hmm. So all of the research we have on cannabis's long-term effects is either coming from observational studies of human beings, meaning cannabis exposure is not happening randomly in the population. It's happening because people being studied are either choosing or not choosing to use cannabis, and they're choosing the extent to use it as well. Or we have data from animal models where researchers can expose these organisms to kind of as much cannabis as they want for as long as they want and observe the effects and in most cases try to extrapolate those to human beings. So those have kind of been the two types of research that have dominated research in this space. And of course, animal models of psychosis are difficult and not an exact match to psychosis in the human condition. So I'd say most of the influential research on this cannabis psychosis link has come from this kind of observational epidemiological tradition where they're assessing, groups of people, say adolescents, for their cannabis use in early life. And they follow them into adulthood or into at least late adolescence, periods of life where psychotic illnesses are more likely to develop or manifest. And they're asking the question, is it the case that, adolescents or folks who are using more cannabis at baseline are more likely to develop these types of long-term psychotic illnesses in later life or adulthood?
Mm-hmm. So to summarize my understanding here, two major types of studies. One is the experimental study. The other is the observational. Experimental studies, you could actually then bifurcate again. So you've got animal studies where, we can take lab rats or lab mice or whatever, and we can do real causal studies. We can give them well-defined doses of drugs, the rat's living in a controlled environment its entire life. We don't have to worry about all of those confounders that we have to for these other studies. But at the end of the day, you really can't know if the results you see in a lab animal are ultimately going to translate to a human being.
That's right.
On the human experimental side, we can do clinical trials, interventions like that. Those are good, you said, for acute effects because, we can have someone come in today, give them cannabis or give them some other experimental manipulation and measure what's happening right then and there. But you can't really do a 20-year-long experiment on the chronic effects because it's simply not feasible to do that.
Yes, and particularly in children and adolescents, individuals who can't give their own consent to participate in those types of studies. So that leaves us with these observational studies where you can follow people in the long term, but you've got this other issue where you just cannot control for all of the variables that one would like to control for. And so, this is obviously where we're going with this in your work. Can you summarize like the history of the observational studies so far? And what have the results tended to be, and what have the gaps and the controversies sort of always been that have haunted this area? Yeah, great question. So the observational research on cannabis and psychosis, I think it's fair to say, has been pretty darn consistent. So you'll have different cohorts from different areas of the world, and people will pretty uniformly find that individuals who are reporting more cannabis use at baseline time point A are also more likely to be diagnosed with a psychotic illness or are more likely to report scientific symptoms at follow-up time point B. And that tends to be true regardless of how you're assessing psychosis. So it's true if you're asking people to self-report on their symptoms. It's also true if you're looking at medical diagnoses made by trained health professionals. There are medical registry studies that have come out of the Scandinavian countries where they're able to kind of make those linkages by actually pulling people's medical records in extremely large population samples. But kind of the issue, like you alluded to, is cannabis use is non-random in the population. So there are characteristics that maybe aren't universally shared by individuals who use cannabis, but are more common in folks who use cannabis, and particularly those who use it heavily and from an early age. And so the big limitation of these observational studies, of course, is it's impossible to know really whether it's cannabis itself that seems to be driving this association, or whether it is other unmeasured factors that these folks using a lot of cannabis, and particularly using early, share in common that also makes them more vulnerable to psychotic illnesses later in life.
So the literature has been fairly consistent overall from these observational studies over the years. In general, the sort of key result, I guess, being that there's a relationship between cannabis use and psychosis. In particular, if you are heavily using cannabis starting early in life, there seems to be a fairly clear signal there that it's associated with an increased risk of developing some kind of psychotic disorder. But basically what you're saying is, because cannabis use, especially heavy use, is non-random, this is a classic case where we really don't know if correlation is telling us there's some underlying causation, or whether or not it's a coincidence and there's something else. So I'm curious, what are like the plausible something else's that one would think about for this topic?
Yeah, great question. And before I even get to that, I want to note that the results that I just summarized are not psychosis specific. So there's a whole literature on cannabis use and its later life consequences. And it's in the epidemiological kind of observational world, almost all of it is bad news. Mm-hmm. So you find that folks who use cannabis earlier are not only at risk for psychosis, but they're also at higher risk for depression, anxiety, other substance use problems. They're showing lower IQ, cognitive impairment. They are going less far in school. They're acquiring less prestigious jobs. They're winding up in career paths with lower income. So not cannabis specific, but of course, the kind of fundamental question that we need to be asking ourselves is this a direct result of cannabis use, or is this something else? And so some of those something else's, one that I think about is, it's very well established that rates of childhood adversity are elevated among individuals who go on to smoke cannabis, particularly at great length and particularly early in life. And we know that different types of childhood adversity, exposure to, say, maltreatment, domestic violence, neighborhood crime, all of these things are kind of globally associated with both poor mental health, as well as kind of cognitive problems and probably worse chances later on in life. And then another potential factor is genetics. So we know that genetic risk of cannabis use and genetic risk of psychosis are to some level correlated, suggesting that genes responsible for contributing to risk of one of these phenotypes, one of these outcomes, are also perhaps contributing to cannabis use.
So to clarify that, is the idea that it's possible, or actually that we know that there are genetic risk factors that have something to do with making your brain more likely to develop something like psychosis and make you more likely to develop a substance use problem with cannabis or something else.
Yeah, that's right. That's what the results of those genetic correlation studies seem to suggest. Whether that is mediated by the brain, in other words, like there are genes that are having a kind of causal impact on brain structure and functioning, I think is a little less clear. It could be, for example, that you have certain genetic variants that are just correlated with being, raised in certain environments. And we could see the correlation arising for sort of those types of reasons. Mm-hmm. But yes, there does seem to be at least a possibility that there's kind of what we call genetic pleiotropy, which is the idea that there are genetic variants that are increasing risk for both of these phenotypes, these outcomes at the same time.
Mm-hmm. I see. And that's pretty common, right? So when we say that a gene is pleiotropic, we mean that it does a number of things, basically. And, it's very natural for people, especially non-genetics people, to think about particular genes having very sort of specific and nuanced effects. But in reality, most of them do lots of stuff that affects many aspects of our lives.
That's right. Yeah. And you can find genetic correlations between anything. It's really a question of magnitude, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's very difficult to draw a straight line from kind of the current state of the knowledge between specific genes or genetic variances and these outcomes. But at least from the genetically informative studies that we have, they're at least raising this as a strong possibility that we should consider, because if the link between cannabis use and psychosis is due to shared genes or any of these other kind of unmeasured third factors, it means that, any kind of policy change, any kind of clinical intervention that's targeting cannabis use is really not going to move the needle on psychosis prevalence whatsoever.
I see. So this is really a classic case of, is this correlation or causation? We've got a strong and consistent correlation between early cannabis use and psychosis across many studies, but we've also got many plausible confounding factors, which are just difficult to control for. I know that one way that is often powerful for teasing apart some of this stuff when we're thinking about genes and environment and all of these types of things are twin studies, which is the type of study that I think you did. So can you explain what twin studies are for people and what they're generally good for?
Yeah, so twin studies have a lot of different uses, but the reason that I really love twin studies is because when you're tackling these types of questions, it's kind of a very, very specific type of research question that is kind of forms the basis of my research career. So they are questions, concerning the relationship between an exposure and an outcome, where you can't really rely on experimental results because either it's unethical to do it in humans or it's somewhat uninformative to do it in animals. And then you also can't really rely on just straight individual level observational results because of this problem of residual confounding. And so the fact that you can't rely on experimental results suggests you have to turn to observational data in one way or another. But the way people traditionally do that is they follow a cohort of individuals. They try to come up with a list of potential alternative explanations for the associations they're seeing. So for example, I mentioned, there's the possibility that, cannabis use and mental health outcomes could come down to could come down to kind of shared roots in increased exposure to some kind of childhood adversity. So if I'm running my observational study, I might go ahead and try to measure that. I might try to develop a measure to get a sense of to what extent the participants in my study are exposed to domestic violence or maltreatment in the home. And then I can enter that measure into my statistical models and I can say, well, I've controlled for that and I'm still seeing my relationship. So I know that this particular thing isn't responsible for the association that I've observed. Problem with that, though, is that, if we sat here, Nick, the two of us, I bet could probably come up with a list of at least 15 to 20 reasonable, plausible, and perhaps even data-driven alternative explanations. So we could create a very long list of measures, of constructs, of things that people in these observational studies would kind of have to go in, develop a measure for, administer that measure, collect the data, and add it to their statistical models.
And at the end of the day, you really are just guessing. You can't make a complete list.
That's right. the list is always going to be incomplete. And then there's a further problem, which is that if you add enough covariates into your model, whether they're super important or not, eventually your main effect is going to dwindle down to zero. That's sort of a statistical certainty because you're just going to be removing bits of variance from your sort of explanatory pie piece by piece by piece, and eventually there will be nothing left. So the kind of beauty of twin studies is that they introduce a set of controls into your models without you having to go out and measure or explicitly include anything at all. Mm-hmm. So twins are born at the same time. They are born into the same families. They live in the same house most of the time. They live in the same neighborhood. They go to the same school. And in the case of monozygotic twins or identical twins, they also share 100% of the same genes. Mm-hmm. So what you can do if you understand twin modeling is you can kind of take your research question, and rather than ask, is it true that people in my unrelated sample of the general population, is it true that people in that sample who use cannabis more frequently are more likely to experience psychosis? I can ask, in the case of twins, if you have a twin that's using more cannabis than their co-twin, is that the twin who's more at risk for a psychotic illness? And asking that question is actually a lot more powerful and informative than the first question, because when you're asking the second question, you're holding this whole suite of potential covariates constant across your twins because they share just so much in common.
Yeah. So I guess the idea is if you look at data from enough pairs of twins, let's just say that you're looking all at identical twins. So they all share the same genome for each pair. If they're all growing up in the same household, there's a bunch of environmental factors that you don't even need to measure directly, but you know that they're going to be pretty well shared. You know, obviously they were in the same womb, born to the same family, all of this stuff. And if you've just got enough of those twins, and you're measuring, in this case, say, cannabis use and psychosis, if you're lucky and a good enough number of those pairs of twins dissociate such that like one of them uses more of the substance than the other one, you can now sort of disentangle the effect of that one thing, knowing that you're pretty well controlling for genetics and as many environmental factors as you could possibly control for in a study like this.
That's right. And I want to offer one caveat with this, which is that even a co-twin control design, you're not controlling for everything, right? Mm-hmm. So if any of your listeners or viewers are themselves twins, they will know that even twins, even identical twins, will differ from one another in myriad different ways. They will have slightly different life experiences. They might have different personalities, different IQs, make slightly different friend groups, kind of the whole nine yards. But what you can know, at least from a twin study, is that you're holding this one important set of covariates constant. And when you observe a within twin difference, the kind of explanatory universe for that difference has shrunk considerably. Mm-hmm. So it's either you're observing a causal effect of your exposure, in this case, cannabis, or you're observing an effect of one of these what we call non-shared factors on which twins conceivably differ. And what you can do in a twin context also is if you have a very strong suspicion as to what another important non-shared factor might be, you can introduce that as a covariate into your models. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot easier and more practical to do than my first example, because again, the universe of potential confounds and explanations is significantly smaller. Mm-hmm. So an example of that I'll give to make that a little more concrete is like in a lot of my research, I will co-vary for other substance use to make sure that I'm capturing the effects of cannabis specifically. So I might introduce into my models controls for twin differences in alcohol use or nicotine being kind of the two most common other substances. I
see. So before we get to the results of your twin study, I think one important thing to say up front is, so you've had this sort of relatively long history of a pretty good number of observational studies being done, not necessarily twin studies, just observational studies to do with cannabis use in adolescents and psychosis. There's this link there. Some of them probably control for a very small number of possible confounds. Some of them probably control for a medium amount. Some of them probably went to great lengths to control for as many as they could think of. is there any systematic relationship between what the end result tended to look like in studies with a lot of controlled variables versus those with a few?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not entirely sure I know the answer for the cannabis and psychosis literature specifically, but I can say I've been working on a paper reviewing the literature on cannabis and cognitive ability, and then cannabis and educational outcomes recently. And a very common pattern that you do see that people will identify in review articles or any kind of summation piece is that a general pattern is the more covariates entered into the models, the smaller the effects become, which can point, like we've been saying, to the fact that this is not actually a simple causal relationship that we're looking at. But on the other hand, I mentioned earlier, any model you've got, if you add more covariates, you're kind of taking away unexplained variation. You're going to kind of see that effect no matter what.
Yeah.
So,
it really is impossible to get to a firm conclusion.
Yeah, it's certainly difficult from the kind of individual level epidemiological observational tradition. I think the best you can do is you can select a few very important covariates to rule out a few very sort of salient or obvious alternative explanations. But like we were talking about earlier, there's always the possibility that there's
something you didn't think about,
something you didn't consider, right?
Yeah. Okay, so I think this brings us to your study. So what was your study? How did you set it up, and why did you do it the way you did it, given everything that we've discussed so far?
Yeah, so I have actually a few papers now that kind of follow this general strategy. So I was analyzing data from an observational but longitudinal twin study that was conducted at the University of Minnesota. It's called the Minnesota Twin and Family Study. And so what the Minnesota Twin and Family Study did was they recruited, kind of at the genesis, it was 3 cohorts of twins in adolescence. They asked them to report on their cannabis use over the past year, and they did that at multiple times throughout adolescence. And then in adulthood, they conducted a bunch of assessments looking at twins' mental health, looking at their cognitive ability, looking at their socioeconomic attainment and achievement. And one of the measures that I thought was particularly interesting, given this controversy about cannabis and psychosis, is they administered a measure of what's called psychoticism, which is sort of like taking that psychosis construct we talked about, but putting it on a continuum. Because fundamentally, that's what psychosis is. It's something that's kind of present to a lesser or greater extent across the population. And of course, in the clinical world, we sort of try to find a cut point to segregate people into individuals who would probably benefit from clinical attention and treatment versus those who are probably okay without that. So I sort of took these collections of measures. I had kind of cannabis use frequency and number of uses in adolescence and psychoticism in adulthood. And I analyzed it 2 different ways. So I asked first the question of, well, do we see in our data this same relationship that all these other epidemiological studies are reporting, wherein twins who are using more cannabis are, as adults, also scoring higher on our measure of psychoticism? And then I wanted to take it a step further, and I wanted to actually exploit kind of the twinness of the data. And so I did what's called a co-twin control analysis, which is where I look within the individual twin pairs. And of course, I'm aggregating across all of them. But within each individual twin pair, I'm basically asking the question, well, is it the case that the twin who's reporting using more cannabis is also scoring as more psychotic than their co-twin? Because that takes into account this kind of wide range of control variables that we keep alluding to.
And when we're thinking about this study, can you say a little bit more about the cannabis itself? Do we know, to what extent is this self-reported data versus the usage being measured in some independent fashion? And do we know anything about the THC content or the type of cannabis being consumed, or is it just
Great question. So those 2 things are unknown. So that's a limitation of this study. certainly, is that we don't have objective measures with which to kind of verify the twins self-report. We're sort of relying on them to be honest reporters of use. And we don't know anything about THC concentration. But what I will say we probably can assume with a reasonable degree of certainty is that the cannabis that these twins were using is probably just slightly less potent than a lot of the cannabis being consumed today, because studies that have looked at changes in cannabis potency over time find, generally speaking, an almost linear increase in THC content as time goes on. Mm-hmm. So those are like two important things I think to keep in mind as we discuss the results of this study. And I'm happy to also talk about how that influences kind of how I think about these findings in future directions.
Okay. Well, can you walk us through the basic results of what you found?
Yeah, so it was pretty simple at its core. So when we looked at the individual level, which means when I ran my analyses in my sample and I kind of ignored the twinness of the data, I treated them essentially as individuals, but nested within family. I saw kind of that typical relationship that everyone else reports. So in this case, it was the twins who were using the most cannabis in adolescence. They were also kind of as a group or across the spectrum, because I was treating them both as continuum. They were reporting kind of the most psychotic-like symptoms as adults. Mm-hmm. And so that fit nicely in with what folks had already shown.
Yeah, you replicated previous results, and that's exactly what you would expect, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Because the literature has been pretty consistent on that point up until this point. So then I went into kind of my co-twin control analyses and looked at whether it was the case that I also observed this within twin pairs. And when I went to that level, it turned out that the kind of the estimate for the causal effect of cannabis, or at least the estimate for the effect of cannabis on psychosis, controlling for the twins' level of cannabis exposure, was just about 0.
I see. So in other words, if cannabis was the driver of psychosis, you would expect that when you find examples of twins where one is using cannabis more than the other one, then you should see a higher rate of psychosis in the twin using more cannabis than the one using a little bit of cannabis.
That's right. Or at least a higher score on our measure of psychosis,
score.
But yes.
But you did not see that.
That's right. So at least on average across the board, the twins who reported using more cannabis were scoring just as highly on our measure of psychoticism as twins who were using less cannabis. So that sort of flies in the face of this hypothesis that it's actually the cannabis exposure in adolescence that is causing psychotic symptoms and psychotic illnesses that stick with people for most of their lives.
Mm-hmm. And because we're talking, at least for a subset, about identical twins, does that point to, at least point to somewhat the idea that there could be some shared, this does or doesn't have something to do with genetics?
Yeah, so the sort of two explanations remaining to us, given these findings, would be that the association is due either to shared genetic liability, so genes that predispose people to use cannabis, and also to psychosis, or at least psychotic-like symptoms, or it's something to do with shared environmental factors. So it could be, again, kind of harkening back to that possibility that I raised earlier. It could be greater exposure to childhood diversity. It could be, socioeconomic status related. Could be kind of myriad other factors. So we didn't dive too deeply into figuring out, what kind of is responsible for this association, given we've ruled out the causal effect. But I do think that could be potentially interesting work in and of itself. But what we really tried to do with this paper was get at whether there's really a strong case for believing that if I reduce people's exposure to cannabis, I'm also going to improve their mental health. Mm-hmm. And at least the results of this particular paper suggest that that is not the case.
So can you give us a sense for the size of the data set here? Was this a relatively large number of twins that you were able to look at?
Yeah, so the total sample size was 1,544. So we had the psychosis measure available in 2 out of our 3 twin cohorts. So I've previously published a separate paper looking at a more diverse range of mental health outcomes and other outcomes, which was slightly larger than this one, just because I was able to combine data across the 3. So it's certainly a decent sized sample, and we had pretty good variability across both of our relevant measures. But of course, it also does pale in comparison to, say, these large like national registry studies, which are, often entire populations of small Scandinavian countries. So there is that. But of course, the primary advantage is that those studies can't kind of tease apart causality in the same way that we were able to here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so to summarize again, basically, if your study holds true, then we could ask the question, if you have 2 identical twins, and one of them starts to smoke pot when they're a teenager and one of them does not, the one that does start smoking pot will not be at greater risk for psychosis, assuming these results hold.
That's right.
What would it look like? So how definitive do you think a study like this is? Are there any ways that you maybe could explain the data in a different way?
Yeah, so one of the major weaknesses of a study like this is, it's a single. I mean, it's 3 cohorts, but they're all kind of coming from the same place at the same point in time. So we always have to worry a little bit about generalizability. And I mentioned earlier that there's some good research out there suggesting that the THC levels and kind of the general potency of cannabis products is increasing over time. And so I think one major concern is, even though we don't see any relationship here, these were participants who were using cannabis predominantly in the 1990s and early 2000s. And so it's possible now that we are, a decade or 2 away from that, we might get a slightly different pattern of results if we're looking at adolescents, teens who are using cannabis that is stronger. And then there's also literature out there suggesting that among teens or among people who use cannabis products, their frequency of use is increasing relative to what it was, years or in this case, decades ago. So one of the things I'm actually very keen to do is to try to replicate these results in different samples. So there's a twin study out in Colorado that is designed in a way that's very similar to data I've worked with from Minnesota. So I'm currently in the process of kind of rerunning some of these models in their data to see if they generalize to a different state with a different cannabis legalization status. And then there's a large nationally representative cohort study called the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, which is just collecting data on a nationally representative sample of US teens right now. And so once those teens are fallen into adulthood, I think it'd be really interesting to look at their cannabis exposure and how that relates to later outcomes, because this cohort also has a subset of twins, which would let me kind of repeat the analyses that I did in the paper that we're discussing right now.
Mm-hmm. Did this result surprise you, or were you expecting to maybe see this?
So this particular result actually didn't surprise me. And the reason it didn't surprise me was because I had just finished writing a separate paper, which was looking at the relationship between cannabis exposure in adolescence and, like I was saying, a kind of different set of mental health outcomes, cognitive ability, and socioeconomic outcomes. And so the results of that paper mirror this one pretty well, in that we looked at major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders, antisocial personality disorder, and drug use disorders. And we saw pretty much the same pattern as we did in this paper, which is to say, yes, in the general population, cannabis use associated with increased risk of these bad outcomes. But when you look within twins, the differences are no longer significant or drastically reduced.
So that's interesting. So you've seen this not only for psychosis or psychotic-like symptoms, but for all of these other things as well.
That's right.
And I guess, I could imagine, there's a lot of people that would probably hear that and go like, well, yeah, of course, we all know that, many people would say themselves, we all know from experience that, that relationship was dubious. These people are all just self-medicating. They're actually using the cannabis to help treat their mental health symptoms. So it's in some sense the opposite of what others were concluding.
Sure.
Do you think that's a reasonable conclusion? Like, would you conclude from your studies that there's no kind of mental health risk for adolescents if they start consuming cannabis?
Yeah. So the sort of theoretical model you're evoking with that notion of self-medication is what we would call reverse causation, right? So it's not that cannabis use causes mental health problems. It's that if you're experiencing mental health problems, you might be trying to alleviate them somewhat by smoking cannabis. And so that is one of those sort of alternative explanations for these associations that we see, in addition to the idea that they're caused by unmeasured third variables that people haven't identified. And so my work doesn't itself address the possibility of reverse causation. I think it fits anecdotally with certainly individual patients that I've treated or encountered in the world. And it's one of the reasons why I think longitudinal data that answers this question is so important, because another limitation of the research I've done is that we don't actually have baseline measures of psychoticism in these cohorts. Mm-hmm. So I think it would be really interesting to see, is it the case that, twins who are showing some of these signs of very early onset psychotic or psychotic-like experiences, I think it'd be interesting to see if they are the ones who are more likely to use cannabis, because I think that would speak to your question, Nick.
I think another thing worth talking about here is, your results are very interesting, and basically you're not finding evidence for a causal link between adolescent cannabis use and the development of psychosis. But couldn't someone argue, well, okay, it's not an across-the-board thing. It's not that cannabis use is kicking up everyone's ability to develop psychotic-like symptoms, but perhaps it does in a sub-slice of the population that has particular, say, genetic vulnerabilities to developing schizophrenia. And that's driving all of the other effects that people see in the other studies. Is that possible?
Yeah. So it's an interesting argument, because that is one that is often made when folks are trying to defend this narrative that cannabis causes psychosis. So it might not cause it in the general population, they'll say, but it's possible there's a subset of particularly vulnerable people who are going to be really dramatically affected by it. And I think to some extent that grows out of this observation that if you have a diagnosed psychotic illness, you're, I think, more likely to experience psychotic symptoms if you do use cannabis-like products. So I think that's partially maybe where this story comes from. What I can say about that narrative is it's really hard to empirically disprove, right? Because if you're not naming a specific vulnerability factor,
you can always say that there's some other vulnerability.
Right. And it's probably, to be fair, it's probably a confluence of different factors. It's, I think, very unlikely that it's just one singular vulnerability factor that would account for kind of these differential effects that people hypothesize. But like I'm saying, it's hard to empirically disprove, because if I pick a particular vulnerability factor and I look at it and I see whether that holds true, you can say, well, that wasn't the vulnerability factor that I was thinking about, or I would have measured it in a different way. So we did a little of that in the paper that we're discussing, which is we had genetic data on all of our participants. And so we used that data to calculate what's called a polygenic risk score. So essentially, it gives a kind of crude estimate of a person's genetic risk to a particular condition. So in this case, we looked at genetic risk of schizophrenia. And we kind of calculated this value, this risk score for each of our participants. And we used that variable to ask the question, is it true that, cannabis seems to interact with this genetic risk measure to create particularly large numbers or particularly significant elevations in psychotic symptoms in these genetically vulnerable individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular study, we found that the answer was no. The interaction term wasn't significant.
I see. Okay, so not only do you have a twin study where you know, because you're dealing with twins, that they have shared genomes, but you actually had some genetic data. So you were able to look at some genetic data for them, and for each person you have a score, perhaps not unlike something that you might get on a 23andMe or a service like that.
That's right.
It kind of tells you what their risk for schizophrenia was. And you were asking the question, okay, we don't see a relationship between cannabis use and psychosis across the board, across all the twins. But if you then pull out the twins that have a particularly high schizophrenia risk score from the genetics data that you had, do they have this? And you're saying you also did not observe the relationship there.
That's right.
Got it.
And what I want to get across probably to your viewers, and obviously folks can go ahead and read the article themselves if they're interested, but we really tried our hardest to find the relationship that I guess the pro cannabis causes psychosis camp would want us to find. So I did sort of sensitivity analyses looking at, only the twins who reported using the highest levels of cannabis, or only looking at the twin pairs with the highest levels of cannabis discordance, to really see if there's a really substantial difference in cannabis use, then do we see this effect? We look at this interaction with a genetic vulnerability factor, kind of the best one that we could identify given the state of the literature so far. We didn't see an effect there. So it really seemed like no matter how we sliced our data, the evidence of a causal effect wasn't showing up. So that gives me a little more confidence in communicating this story to you and to the wider world.
Interesting. And you mentioned it earlier, but can you just say again a little bit more on what's next? What kind of studies are you looking to do to follow up on this?
Yeah. So biggest questions, I think, are number one, can we ensure that this replicates across different samples? All of our participants came from Minnesota, was a predominantly white cohort, recruited in the 80s, 90s. They're using cannabis in a particular way at a particular time. And since that time, we've seen kind of enormous changes in cannabis use, just secular changes over time. People are using in different ways, they're using different products, there are different potencies. And even though the kind of overall prevalence of teen cannabis use in particular seems to be going down, people who are using cannabis are tending to use it with a lot more frequency than they were kind of back in the day. So I think it's really important to double check to see whether our results hold given these kind of contemporary changes in cannabis use that are occurring right now. So those are sort of the next steps that I'm eyeing. And then in particular, I'm also really interested to not only investigate this cannabis and mental health connection, but I'm also trying to do some follow-up work on the relationship between cannabis use and socioeconomic outcomes in young adulthood. Because one of my findings that we didn't really get a chance to discuss very much so far is that while there isn't much evidence to support a causal relationship between cannabis use and these mental health outcomes, we actually were seeing patterns in our co-twin control models that are consistent with a possible causal effect of teen cannabis use on adult socioeconomic outcomes. So we're seeing some evidence that twins who use more cannabis than their co-twins are doing less well, socioeconomically speaking, in terms of their education, their occupational status, and their income in young adulthood. So that is a finding that I'm keen to also follow up and see if that holds true across different samples and at different times.
Interesting. So let's just say, your results are published, or they will soon be published, I think.
These are both published. Those articles we're referring to are out there.
So that's fantastic. Congratulations. First of all, I know this is a lot of work.
Thank you.
So you've got these two studies out there, one that says no link that we can find between cannabis use and psychosis. And you've got another one saying also no link between cannabis use and these other negative mental health outcomes. So I'm going to pretend I'm, a cannabis retail executive of some kind right now, and I've got a few $1 million in the bank, and I say, great, there's scientific evidence that there's no problem with adolescent cannabis use. We let them buy cigarettes when they're 18, so we should be lobbying to decrease the legalization age for cannabis, or when you can buy it, from 21 to 18. Do you think that's a reasonable argument to make from the data that you've generated?
Yeah, interesting question. So I think it's reasonable to conclude, based on the data I've generated, that the causal link between cannabis and mental health, if it exists, is not particularly strong. I hesitate a little bit when people talk about, extrapolating from these results to say that early cannabis use in general is no problem, something that we should not be concerned about. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because of these other findings that I mentioned, which is that there does seem to be some evidence that there's a causal relationship between cannabis use and how well you're doing, financially, educationally, occupationally, as an adult.
Mm-hmm. And it would be bizarre, would it not, if there was no effect of any kind from heavy cannabis use during relatively early periods of life and brain development?
Yeah, in some sense. Although, I think, the story that I think the data are kind of converging on, or at least my sort of pet hypothesis, is that the adult outcomes we're seeing that do appear to be related to cannabis use in a causal fashion. I'm not so sure that those associations are mediated by long-term changes in brain or neurodevelopment. I think it might be easier to just say they are long-term consequences of you using a bunch of pot when you're a teenager, right? Because if you are using a bunch of pot as a teen and you're kind of experiencing the typical short-term effects that we all know is associated with cannabis use, maybe it's kind of increased relaxation, decreased motivation. I wonder if the simplest explanation is just that impacts your performance in school, and that then impacts your kind of educational and socioeconomic attainment later in life. And that these effects are not so much about cannabis exerting really dramatic effects on brain development, but it's more about short-term effects that are limited in scope with long-term consequences.
I see. So that idea would basically be saying that, and there's nothing, intrinsically good or bad about this in any like ethical sense, but almost the cannabis use would be a marker of how you were choosing to spend your time.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, if you're choosing to spend it on, certain things and not certain other things, that's probably going to have some downstream consequence in terms of how, what these other outcomes look like.
Yeah. And again, the reason I say it, right, is because when we look at the behavioral outcomes that we would expect to really be yoked very closely to brain development, when we look at mental health and we look at cognitive ability, sort of the repeated finding, at least from my perspective, is when we do these causally informative studies, these twin studies, we're seeing small to nil effects. And that's not really consistent with this idea that cannabis has dramatic effects on the brain and the way it's organized and the way it develops. That's not to say now that there couldn't be a thresholding effect. This is again sort of pulling an ad hoc kind of alternative theory out of thin air, but it could be at a particular level of cannabis exposure, the effects on the brain really do become noticeable, and we start to see effects that are mediated by a more sort of neural specific pathway. I can't disprove that with the data that I have available, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to follow up on these results. But I would say that what the literature seems to suggest so far is that cannabis, as it's generally used in the population of adolescents, doesn't seem to be exerting these really terrible consequences on neural integrity or mental health.
I see. Well, you did mention something early on in the discussion that you've worked on that I haven't looked at any of these papers, so I really don't know what the answers are, although I can guess maybe which direction they go in. You mentioned that you had worked with other you've done other research on other environmental variables that can affect life outcomes for people.
Mm-hmm.
One of those was environmental exposure to lead.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if we could switch gears and you can sort of unpack for me what we know in that area.
Sure. So the lead literature is a little bit different than the cannabis literature, because with lead exposure, it's really hard to bring twins to bear on this question. Because your level of lead exposure is usually tied to the type of environment you find yourselves in. So whether that's because you're getting exposure through lead pipes that need replacing, like in Flint, Michigan, or you're getting exposure due to leaded gasoline products, which was the case in the cohorts that we were looking at because they were drawn predominantly from the 70s and 80s. Members of a single family are going to be pretty similar in their level of exposure to these kind of pollutants. So it's difficult to find enough variability across members of a family to apply some of these methods that I'm so excited about. So our paper is looking at lead and air pollution, tying those to mental health. Unfortunately, weren't able to make too much use of twin data, but what we were able to do at least was look longitudinally across time and just ask the simple question of, is greater exposure to these toxicants in adolescence associated with worse mental health in adulthood? And so in this case, we are not able to control for things using the sort of more powerful twin method, which is my preference, but we were at least able to do what folks typically do in these epidemiological studies, which is we were able to come up with a short list of potential alternative explanations. We were able to develop a list of, robust covariates to enter into our models, and we were able to see that at the end of the day, even though we tried to, get the effect to go away by introducing controls for other possible explanations, we found that this relationship seemed to be pretty robust. That is, that there does seem to be at least a small, reliable association between your level of exposure to these toxicants in early life and worse mental health as an adult.
One of the things that I think is top of mind for a lot of people, just to sort of pull back or zoom out a little bit, is, for the last 2-ish years now, we've all been in this interesting new or newish environment that has to do with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. My understanding, it's only a cursory understanding, but my understanding is, mental health issues are basically getting worse across the board, just because people have had lots of stressors introduced into their life based on how things have changed as the pandemic has played out. Can you comment on that generally? Is that actually what we're seeing? Are rates of depression, anxiety, other things actually going up? And can you maybe comment on, what your recommended coping mechanisms might be for the average person, given your professional background?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I'm not super familiar with the literature that's coming out looking specifically at your question, which is, do we see empirical evidence suggesting that mental health conditions are increasing over the course of the pandemic? I can think of papers I've come across that would support that. I think there have been at least a few that have reported, more visits to the psychiatric emergency rooms of local hospitals. I'm sure there are others that have addressed this question, but they're not something that I've paid particularly close attention to. But what I can say is that what I have done a lot of research on is just the prevalence of mental health problems in our society more generally. Mm-hmm. So this is pre-COVID. And what this research does is it kind of compares estimates of diagnosable mental health problems that we get from cross-sectional studies where you're interviewing people about mental health at one time point, and longitudinal studies, which are the kind of studies that I work with most closely, where you're interviewing people about mental health repeatedly across the life course. And so what these studies tell us, and this is again pre-COVID, these are cohorts who, for the most part, I think grew up again in kind of the 70s, 80s, 90s. When you look at assessments that are conducted at a single time point, you get rates of mental disorder that are about half that of what you get when you're asking people about mental health repeatedly over time. So in the cohorts that I work with that have these repeated assessments of mental health, you find that a staggeringly high percentage of people meet criteria for a diagnosable mental health problem at some point over the life course. So in Minnesota Twin and Family Study, I believe our rates are around 70%. In the Dunedin study, which I've used to look at some of these environmental toxicants, rates are as high as 80, 83, 85% of the population. So when you think about COVID occurring against that backdrop, for me, I think about it as probably a global stressor that's taking an already highly prevalent problem and probably kicking it up just a little bit higher. As far as coping, that's a really good question. I think what's been most useful for me personally is getting back to some sort of exercise routine. It's trite, it's basic, but it's true. I think physical health has been huge in kind of maintaining mental health during the pandemic. I think staying connected socially with folks as much as possible has been, again, huge. And as restrictions are lifting, I found also, so's my mood, because I'm finally able to, like this Thanksgiving, was able to get together with some friends and some family.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised at how little emphasis, at least in the mainstream, you see placed on just physical exertion as a mental health, in your mental health toolkit. Yeah.
And that's one of those questions that we can study using these really strong empirical designs, right? There are plenty of randomized controlled trials showing pretty definitively that exercise does have positive effects on mental health.
Mm-hmm. And you sort of mentioned that, even pre-COVID, at least certain mental health issues have been on the rise for quite a while. Is that an area that you know more about in detail? Like, for example, rates of depression, anxiety, what have those been looking like in the US, at least over, say, a 10 or 20 year time period?
Yeah, good question. So my research doesn't deal so much with kind of secular changes in incidence of disorders over time. But what the research I've done does suggest is sort of the better that we measure mental health in our research, kind of the more prevalent we find that it is. And so what you notice in psychology and psychiatry over time is this shift in just how the field perceives these conditions. And my hope is this trickles down to the general population. And honestly, it could still probably do with a little bit more trickling, I think, within psychiatry and psychology. But we've sort of moved, I think, in the past couple of decades from thinking about, mental health conditions as these disorders that affect a small, unfortunate subset of the population to, the national comorbidity surveys of the 1990s, which returned at the time, very surprising finding that they affect roughly 50% of the US adult population, to now, where we have findings from these multi-decade longitudinal studies that are measuring mental health really closely and doing it repeatedly over time, suggesting that actually the proportion of the population that experiences a diagnosable mental health problem is north of 70, 80%. So I think public understanding of mental health has been changing, and our understanding of what it takes to measure mental health well has changed. What I'm less certain about is whether any of these changes reflect kind of increases or decreases in mental health problems over time due to different factors, including COVID.
I see. So you would say that you don't know the answer to that it's difficult to answer the question, when we look at rates of mental health issues today in the US, to what extent is that us just getting better at finding and measuring things versus us just becoming actually more mentally unhealthy today?
I think that's always the question, right? So the studies that are kind of informative to this point, I do know they're ones that are kind of applying the same diagnostic or assessment procedure repeatedly over time. And so those are the studies that you want to be looking at, obviously, to answer this question, to see if the numbers are actually going up without a underlying change in the measurement system. And I think the studies that are going to be most informative to that point are going to be studies that are following a nationally representative sample prospectively, rather than looking at rates of people going to hospitals or seeking psychiatric services or engaging with the mental health care system, right? Because you could certainly see secular trends in people's willingness to enter psychotherapy or go see a psychiatrist or seek help without there being a corresponding change in the actual underlying rates of disorder. So I think it's important to be able to tease those apart.
Well, the work that you've done is very interesting, Jonathan. I think we covered a lot of good ground today. On the main topic we discussed of the relationship between adolescent cannabis use and mental health outcomes, is there anything you want to say at the end to sort of tie things together or point people to in terms of places they can go to learn more?
Sure. Yeah. So there are a couple different research groups internationally that have been focusing on this question for years and years. One of them that I'm fortunate enough to be affiliated with at the moment is the Minnesota Center for Twin and Family Research at the University of Minnesota. So we are using our twin data to answer important questions about the relationship between cannabis and later life outcomes, also looking at alcohol exposure, smoking use. So lots of interesting findings kind of coming out from that group on a daily basis, but that could be a whole another podcast episode. And then there are, of course, other groups that are also doing this work internationally. And I guess I'd give a shout out to my graduate school mentors who have their own cohort of twins in the United Kingdom. So that's Terry Moffat and Avshalom Caspi at Duke University, and they do a lot of this work as well. So I would say if folks are interested in learning more about the state of twin research and its intersection with the cannabis world, I think those are two great places to start. And of course, you can always look me up on the internet, Google Scholar, Jonathan Schaefer, and then I'm also on Twitter at John Schaefer, PhD. So you can always feel free to drop me a line there, and happy to answer any questions I get.
All right, Jonathan. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick. This was great.